Hello and welcome to New Humanum. My guest today is Professor Nigel Biggar. Professor Biggar is an ethicist and he's the Professor of Moral Theology at Oxford University, Professor Emeritus, I should say. He's also an author, and his most recent book, Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning, has shot to the top of the bestseller lists. So welcome, Nigel.
Thanks, Robin.
Let's start with an obvious question. What is an ethicist, and what do ethicists actually do?
Yes, it's a bit of a conversation stopper, almost as much as theologian. So an ethicist focuses his or her attention on questions of good and evil and right and wrong. So moral questions. In the course of my 30-plus year career as a Christian ethicist, I've done work on such things as the ethics of legalizing euthanasia, or making peace and doing justice after civil conflict, and issues of forgiveness and reconciliation. I published a book with the provocative title In Defense of War about 9 years ago. I've done one on what's wrong with rights, question mark at the end of it, and then recently the one on colonialism. So my expertise is moral analysis, but as a Christian, I always try and think morally in the light of basic Christian convictions.
What was the young Nigel Biggar like when you were a schoolboy? I mean, was becoming an ethicist an obvious thing for you?
No, I couldn't have spelt it, I don't think, in those days. No, and I was brought up in southwest Scotland. My mother was English, my father was Scottish. All my father's family were either in farming or agriculture. My father didn't farm, but he worked for a firm that produced cattle feed. I think, like a lot of British middle-class people, my generation was the first to go to university. And so whereas all my family was in agriculture, in my father's generation now, I think there's only one or two of us in agriculture, the rest of us have been professionalised. So I grew up in southwest Scotland. My parents were not church-going. I once went to the Church of Scotland Sunday school and was so bored I never went again. But I then went off to a prep school in Ayrshire run by an English couple who are evangelical Anglicans, and I think that's probably where my interest in Christianity was sparked. But it was a long way from that. That was about age 8 or 9. It was a long way from there to becoming a theologian.
I'm sure, but you then went to a school down in Somerset, Moncton College, which has a history of evangelicalism.
Yes.
It's an evangelical foundation. How much did that impact on you, the fact that the school had a religious ethos? Enormously.
So there was a direct route from my prep school in Ayrshire to Moncton because the English headmaster of my Ayrshire prep school and his wife were both evangelical Anglicans, and they had sent their son to Moncton and persuaded my parents to let me take a scholarship exam to Moncton, which I got. And so instead of going to either a private school in Edinburgh or Yorkshire, as my father's family tended to send their kids to Yorkshire, I came much further south to Bath in 1968 at the age of 13. Which is where I lost my Scottish accent within a term. At the beginning of the scrum in September '68, I would be shouting. At the beginning of term, I would be shouting "push, push," but by Christmas it was "push, push." But no, so Moncton had and still has a living evangelical Anglican tradition, and it was there in my first year, I think, that I became a self-conscious Christian. Although the seeds had been planted earlier.
Did you ever waver after that in your Christianity, or was it something which just seized you and you knew this was right for you and right?
Well, it took a while to get there. I mean, I often look back and wonder what happened at age 13 to make me decide to become a Christian, and frankly, I keep staring at it, and it remains pretty mysterious. But I remember looking way back at the age of 5 or 6. My father took me to see Cecil B. Mills.
B. de Mille.
B. de Mille, thank you. His King of Kings, which came out in the early 60s.
I remember.
I do remember being really struck by that, so much so, and this sounds slightly unhinged, at the age of 5 or 6, I was in my bed after seeing the film. I remember praying to God to take all the sins off Jesus and put them on me, which was a bit serious for a youngster. But what was curious looking back is this did not come from my parents.
No,
not at all. This was self-generated, or maybe the young Nigel had actually encountered something, a divine reality that was impinging directly on him. So there was that, and then, as I say, my evangelical prep school in Ayrshire, and then Moncton. In my mid-teens, I was pretty depressed, actually, and that didn't entirely clear until, well, I went through various periods of depression, and by the time I left Oxford University in 1976, I was in a period of what I call theological speechlessness. That's to say, I did in fact believe, and I knew that because I ended up in Canada, and I couldn't stop praying for family and friends of mine for whom I cared. It's just that I couldn't make sense of why I believed, and I felt until I could, I had no right to confess it. So I did go through some ups and downs. At one point, I remember when I was particularly depressed in my teens at Moncton, I wanted to sell my Bible, and my friends refused to buy it. I still have it. So yes, it wasn't entirely a smooth road.
I can't imagine that anybody's road to faith is smooth.
No.
Because I don't think it wouldn't be natural, would it, to go through life untroubled by any doubts? I don't think.
No, I think that's right, and faith is bound up with all sorts of deep emotional currents, and certainly my teenage years there were lots of currents there, and quite hard to keep control of one's feelings. But here I am. I remember it must have been about age 12. I told my parents I'd become a Christian, and they were benignly bemused. Didn't quite know what to make sense of this. And I distinctly remember my father putting his hand on my shoulder in the kitchen of our house in southwest Scotland, and he said, "It's okay, son. It's just a phase." Yeah, well, here we are. I'm 67 now. It's been a long phase.
You've made a career of it.
I have.
Because I think in the early 1990s you became ordained finally. First of all, you went into the diaconate. You became a deacon.
Yep.
And then you became a priest, actually.
Yes, I was ordained deacon in 1990 and priest in 91.
Right. And so what was it that, by that stage, clearly you had committed yourself and were fully committed to the idea of it?
Yes.
Was this the culmination of the idea, then, of your personal faith, ordination?
Being a bit of a Protestant Anglican, Robin, I'm disinclined to elevate priesthood too highly. So culmination, I perhaps resist, but I guess it was a certain kind of. It was the next stage on a process of commitment. I mean, partly coming out of an evangelical stable, I wasn't for a while terribly acquainted with or accustomed to very liturgical worship. I had a an instinctive aversion to being swallowed up by institutions. I still do, actually. I still prefer to be on the outside of the inside. And in all sorts of ways, commitments are slightly scary, whether it's marriage or ordination or joining a political party, because there are risks. You never quite know what the future's going to bring. But at age 27, in 1982, I got married. I got over that one. Took the risk of that. And people had said to me from my early 20s, my mid-20s, Nigel, you should think of becoming a priest. And I said, no thanks. But I think what happened in the late 1980s, I'd been in Canada and the United States for 7 years, came back to England in 1985 and was a librarian and research fellow at a now defunct evangelical Anglican research institution called Latimer House in Oxford. And I think I come back with a PhD from the US in theology, so I had a PhD in theology. I was not ordained, but I think I just felt it had to come a point where I took public responsibility for my faith. It's partly that. And also I felt it would be good for me and good for my ethical thinking, if not any good for anyone else, if I became a pastor. I would learn. Maybe that was a rather selfish way of approaching it, but I was aware that I ought to expose myself to, but both publicly as a Christian and pastorally. And that's when I began to think about ordination. And I went to, in Church of England you go to a selection conference, which is a weekend, and I was up in Chester in 1989, I think. And I was actually quite depressed then, for reasons nothing to do with ordination. And at the very last interview with the chief selector in Chester, she sat there rather as you are, and she said to me, Nigel, do you want to become a priest in God's church? And I looked out the window, I looked at the floor, I looked back at her and I said, no. And I subsequently left the room thinking, what on earth did you just say? Why did you say that? What I meant was the selectors had made absolutely clear that a real priest wants to be a parish priest. And I was pretty clear in my own heart, even if I hadn't articulated it, that wasn't how I saw myself. I did not want to give up my academic vocation, and that's what it has always been, a vocation, not just a career, a vocation. And being a parish priest wasn't obviously compatible with that. So that's what I meant. What I meant was, no, I don't want to be your kind of priest. Fortunately, the then Bishop of Oxford, Richard Harries, who has always been a mentor and supporter of mine, the verdict came back. Obviously, the selectors thought I wasn't ready to be ordained. But Bishop Richard, was a bit surprised by this and decided that I should get some informal pastoral experience, which I did as assistant chaplain to Tom Wright when he was chaplain of Worcester College. And then I was going to get some sort of evening classes in sacramental theology and practical instruction. But then the chaplaincy of Oriel College came vacant in early 1990, and I asked Richard Harries, I said, this is the combination of pastoral and academic is exactly what I think I'm fitted for. If I applied for this and got it, would you ordain me to the post? Which is what happened. So I was ordained deacon in September 1990 and started being a deacon with the supervision of a lovely retired hospital chaplain who supervised me. But I started leading, being a liturgical leader, though I didn't obviously celebrate the Eucharist at that point with almost no training.
So I know that part of your official title has, you are a professor of pastoral theology, as well as, so that was part of your official title. So you
Yes.
did you enjoy the pastoral work? I mean, presumably working in a college like Oriel, you're dealing with young people. Was that the main bulk of the work, counselling young people?
Yes.
Did you enjoy that?
Yes, I did. 9 years at Oriel as chaplain, were very happy, and I was paid to be a chaplain. I did do some academic work on the side, but I was paid to be a chaplain. And I enjoyed working with young people. And I learned a lot from them, and I've made some permanent friends out of them. So I did learn a lot, and particularly about, I was always quite keen to know how on earth you sell the faith, sell the wrong word,
I know what
how you communicate it.
Yes.
To people who might not think they're interested. And my preferred model, and it's one that suits my personality, I think, is it thinks of. I thought of myself as someone who would accompany a student along the road for 3 years while they were there, and as we go along, I would point out things on the horizon or in the environment, intimations of God, or intimations of spiritual life that they might not see. So the model is one of being a companion, but some just being alert to things they might not see. And I still think that's right, because I think partly because I wasn't brought up in a Christian household. None of my family were practicing Christians. I've always sympathy for those who look from the outside at what goes on in church and just scratch their heads.
Yes.
I do understand that. Yeah.
I mean, you and I, although I'm a little older than you, but we come from more or less the same generation, and ours is an irreligious generation. Why is it, do you think, so many people have fallen away from the faith over the course of our lifetime since the 1960s? What do you think it is that has drawn people away from it?
That's a really important question. I think I've been asking all my life, really. It's a bit of a mystery in that, as I said earlier, what it is that drew me and why it is that I've stuck is a mystery. But let me just try and answer your question. So first of all, simply in terms of sociology, it has been observed the habit of belonging regularly to associations, be they Boy Scouts or trades unions or any kind of voluntary association, has diminished. So we spend more of our time in our homes watching TV or whatever it is. We don't regularly go out to join other people in activities. So the church going has just become unfashionable for that reason. But part of me, because I myself, I'm even though I'm a Christian and I'm a priest, I understand why church services are boring, because they often are. I understand why sermons aren't interesting, because often they're not. But that doesn't mean I don't think that people who are puzzled and sceptical don't intuit or perceive things. So I do remember two things about my time at Oriel. One is the college has its feast on the 2nd of February, Candlemas, which is a splendid atmospheric occasion in the chapel, which is darkened, and you've got all the candles lit and choirs doing its wonderful thing. And afterwards, one 2nd of February, I ended up in the junior common room bar, where I did a bit occasionally go. I was trying to be trendy. And a female student came up to me and said, Chaplain, I really enjoyed that. She said, but I feel such a fraud because I don't believe. And I can't remember what I said to her at the time, but what came to me to say to her afterwards was, yes, I mean, you say you don't believe, meaning what? I mean, meaning you don't tick every clause of the creed? Well, most people in the church don't. I mean, whether it's a religion or whether it's a political party, you don't sign up for everything. You sign up because, on the whole, you think this makes sense. But there'll be bits of it you don't agree with, or can't make sense of, or not sure what you think about. So the fact you don't swallow the whole package doesn't mean you don't believe. And look, your feet took you. And I have a sermon in my stocks, which has the title, On the Faith of Feet. The fact that people come, something draws them, and the other recollection I have, which is similar, is that at Oriel then and now, like most Oxford colleges, Oxbridge colleges, Sunday evening evensong is a big affair. The choir performs, and often there'll be the head of the college will bring black tie besuited guests for dinner afterwards. Very formal liturgy. Not at all, no concessions to the post-60s. And I remember half a dozen undergraduates, all male, one of them from Liverpool, John from Liverpool, with his bother boots, all wearing gowns over whatever else they were dressed in. They'd come along religiously, but none of them would say they were Christian. No. At that time, although one has since become ordained. The faith of feet. So I guess I can't answer your question. I wish I could answer it better. I think one lesson I'm drawing is, don't think that by jettisoning all the old formal forms, don't think you become more attractive. You may not.
I was reading something the other day and saying that the great battle in faith is to marry reason and the imagination, so that and in our lifetime we've seen the elevation of science, I think, into a sort of well, some people call it scientism, the idea of the deification almost of science. But and I'm sure that in an Oxford context, an Oxford academic context, as your life has been, you must have often had these conversations with people who say, but reason, I rely on my reason, I rely on science, science gives me the answers, and Christianity is just another myth amongst many. Well, what do you say to those people?
Yes. Well, first of all, to say yes, that I've come across, I can think of hard-nosed atheist scientists in Oxford. One or two of them quite famous. I can also think of hard-nosed natural scientists who are men of faith. So the picture is mixed. What do I say of those who say that scientific knowledge is the only form of knowledge? I say no. I mean, the scientific method is very good at grasping the data and the regularities of the physical world. That doesn't mean that the whole of reality is something that scientific method can grasp. If you add to the natural scientific method philosophical materialism, the philosophical belief that there's nothing else but matter, and the two things are quite distinct. So atheist scientists join the two, but natural scientific method doesn't require philosophical materialism. And if you join the two, then human beings are, whatever the kind of superstructure of aesthetic and moral consciousness, it's all really matter, and it's all really about physical survival, isn't it? Well, no, it's really not. And there's a well-known analytical philosopher, Thomas Nagel, published a book 10, 15 years ago called, I think, Mind and Cosmos. And he is and remains an atheist, but he argued in this book, actually, the materialist or the naturalist view that matter is primary doesn't make sense. Actually, mind and value on the one hand and matter on the other are co-original. And he admits that this idea has a more natural home in a theological context, though he himself, being of Jewish heritage and with parents who lost their lives in the Holocaust, because he can't believe in God because of the problem of evil in the world, he can't place these ideas in a theological framework. But it's interesting that notwithstanding his persistent atheism, he recognized that theology makes better sense of the, or at least is a more natural place to put the idea that value and matter are, as it were, co-original. And also it seems to me, even if it's true that we human beings have evolved from other species, and if it's true that other species, all they care about is survival, I mean, maybe that's true for the species we developed from, I want to say, no, it's really true, we have evolved. We are not our origins. So that even if it were once true that at a previous stage of evolution all we cared about was survival, nowadays, given what we've evolved into, no, some of us will sacrifice our lives for justice. Really will. And we'll sacrifice our lives to save other people who are not our kin. Really will. So although, as a Christian, I have to say the problem of evil is a problem. I cannot make sense I cannot make easy sense of belief in God in the light of the fact that really bad things happen to really good people. So that's a problem for me. On the other hand, the atheist materialist will find it quite hard to make sense of any human dignity at all. we both have problems.
Now, you are a prolific writer. You've got many books to your name. You mentioned some of them. What's Wrong About Rights was one which I remember. But recently you've been catapulted into the public arena in a much more dramatic way. Well, you can tell the story yourself, but this arose, did it not, out of the sort of public harassment and shaming of another academic, a Canadian academic, who'd written about the British Empire, saying British Empire not all bad, and you came to his defence when there was some reaction to what he had said. So pick up the story there, because you I mean, with respect, ethicists are not people who we expect often to see in the public square being controversial. I mean,
you don't say.
And so, this last few years of your life must have been quite an extraordinary experience for you, I'd have thought.
Yes, they have been. They have been. So what happened in 2017 were two things. First of all, because I have harboured unfashionable views about empire for some long time, I arranged with a very eminent historian of empire worldwide to launch a research project called Ethics in Empire. And contrary to the persistent belief of some of my critics, this is not about defending the British Empire, this project. It's about examining how did the ancient Chinese view empire morally in ancient China? How did medieval Muslims view Arab empire in the medieval period? So it's really looking at the moral views of empire throughout the ages. That's what that project was about. Well, we launched it in July 2017. It was a great success. Then in November 2017, I published an article in the London Times in which I quoted Bruce Gilley. And he quotes the famous African nationalist and man of letters Chinua Achebe, who, even toward the end of his life, refused to condemn British colonial rule in Nigeria. And I simply argued in this article what I thought was the completely incontrovertible view that we British can find in our colonial history reasons for pride as well as shame. I didn't venture at that point to try and say we can find more reasons for pride than shame. I just said we can find both. I thought no one could possibly argue with that. That was in, I think, November 30th, 2017. Then my wife and I, in the second week of December, we were going off to Germany to celebrate our wedding anniversary. And in the airport, Heathrow Airport, I just checked my email one last time, and there was a message from the Public Relations Directorate at the University of Oxford notifying me that I and my Ethics and Empire project had come under fire from a group of students who'd published a letter online criticising it. 2 days later in Germany, my senior historian colleague emailed me to say, Nigel, you have to make clear that our project is not about defending the British Empire. And I said to him, I wrote to him, you know it's not about that. I know it's not about that. The account I published online about the project last week says it's not about that. Why do I need to defend it? Why do I need to assure people that it's not about that? That was on the Saturday. Sunday, he abruptly resigned from the project. Following week, there were two more online denunciations, one from 58 Oxford academics, mostly junior, and then another from about 200 academics worldwide condemning the project. And that letter was addressed to Oxford University, urging them to withdraw their support for the project. So, in response to your point about my not being accustomed to this, absolutely, I was shocked. Looking back, I was naive, but I was shocked and disoriented. My historian colleague had jumped ship. Friends of mine, an old friend of mine, told me to drop the project. It was too toxic. And my name was in the papers every day until after Christmas, I think, that year. And so, I mean, looking back, what's changed? Social media. So it's easy to launch a mass protest, get people to sign up to something. Most of them didn't really think about it. Easy to do that, and then pretend afterwards, as they still do. This wasn't an attempt to repress you. This was simply a statement of our views. To which my response was, well, next time you find yourself at the sole object of a mass denunciation, you tell me whether it doesn't have repressive effects. What
did that feel like?
Well, of course, when you are publicly attacked in that way by a lot of people, a lot of academics, I wondered, am I daft? Am I daft? And then when people walk away from you, you feel even more shaken, more insecure, more inclined to doubt yourself. But I didn't drop the project. And I think, I mean, it took a, I'm quite slow at figuring out what I feel, and just figuring out what's going on. But looking back, I mean, the behaviour of, I captured, as it happens, I took photo shots of various tweets that Primavera Gopal, the Cambridge academic who started the series of online denunciations, where she, in the inaugural tweet, she says, "OMG, oh my God, this is serious, SHIT. We must, block capitals, shut this down." Right? This wasn't repressive. Anyway, I could wax indignant about that, but it felt very unnerving.
Personal?
Oh yeah. Well, when friends start to desert you, old friends, it felt very personal, and all sorts of emotions, anger, despair, self-doubt, embarrassment, well up.
But that episode, that experience that you underwent, has resulted in this book that you've recently published, just in the past few weeks, Colonialism: A Moral Reckoning. And what struck me about the book, reading it, is that to what extent do you think that empire and evangelism and the missionary experience, of course, that wasn't the purpose of empire, was it? I mean,
no.
I mean, evangelization was not the reason why our forefathers left these shores to go and make money in India. But
no.
It was a sort of byproduct of it, wasn't it? And so the history of the British Empire is very strongly linked, actually, to the missionary experience, the missionary story.
Yes, but no. I mean, I think the first British Empire, which was mainly North America and then India in the 1600s, 1700s, that was, as you suggested, primarily about trade, certainly India, and then in North America it was about setting up bases from which to harry the Spanish, who were then the dominant imperial power, threatening Protestant England. It was also about the hunt for gold. The Puritans were quite keen to convert the natives, but the Puritans were quite brutal toward American Indians. But then I think there was a kind of moral revolution that took place toward the end of the 1700s, which started with the Quakers and then broadened out to the Methodists and the Evangelical Anglicans, and gave birth to the Society for the Abolition of Slavery in 1787, which led to the abolition of the slave trade within the empire in 1807, and then the abolition of slavery in 1833. I think that was... So first of all, that moral revolution, yes, to some extent there were Enlightenment sources, Montesquieu, influencing the literate classes, but mainly it was Christian. And there's John Wesley published a treatise called Thoughts Upon Slavery in 1774, and at the very beginning of the book there's a quotation from the book of Genesis where God is beholding Cain after Cain has slaughtered Abel and saying something to the effect that, where's your brother? And the implication of this is that white and black, master and slave, are common brothers under God, human equality. And it was this Christian sentiment about basic human equality that powered the abolitionist movement. And the abolitionist movement became a widely, maybe the first popular political movement, because I think it's reckoned that a third of the male population of the country signed petitions
Amazing.
to abolish slavery in the late 1700s, early 1800s. So there was that. And then the abolition of slavery continued throughout the empire from the early 1800s till the end in the 1960s. And it broadened out also into humanitarian concern about native peoples in Australia and Africa. So there was, I would say, a persistent Christian egalitarian humanitarianism that shaped imperial policies from the early 1800s. Now, it's true that in the late 1800s, scientific or biological racism came in, the idea that some races, white races are on top and non-white races are inferior naturally and forever. But the Christian conviction of basic human equality persisted, so that in the Canadian Parliament in the 1870s and 80s, when someone would stand up and espouse biological racism, other MPs would stand up and say, no, that's not British, that's not Christian.
Well, I was fascinated in the book because, as you explain it, for some native people, the experience of colonialism, the experience of being enveloped in the British Empire was, in this sense, liberating, because Christianity, I think, well, would you agree with this, that the sort of essence of Christianity is actually subversive of authority, especially authority not justly wielded. So if we are all equal in the sight of God, if we are all to be afforded the same dignity,
yes,
that makes injustice or unjust, harsh rule difficult to defend, doesn't it?
So Christianity was certainly emancipatory with regard to slaves, first of all. But then in Africa, if you read Chinua Achebe's novels, I think the most famous one is called Things Fall Apart, and that's a story about the disturbing impact of colonialism, of modern ways of Christianity in Igbo society at the end of the 19th century. So the presence of Christianity was disturbing because, of course, it challenged given customs and given social structures. But therefore, Christianity was often very attractive to young men or outcasts or young African women who didn't want to undergo female circumcision. So the idea that Christianity was simply dropped onto native peoples and forced down their throats is largely untrue, partly because, certainly in Africa, the British or the Europeans didn't have the manpower to force it upon anybody. And actually colonial officials were not terribly keen on encouraging missionaries, because missionaries disturbed the natives that the colonial officials then have to pacify. So, but no, and the fact that hundreds of millions of Africans are now Christian, and that's much of that is, the European presence in West and East Africa only began in the 1890s. It's just over 130 years old, the European presence, and yet hundreds of millions of Africans are now Christian. There must have been something attractive about it.
And yet, in the popular imagination, such as it engages with missionary activity, I think the image of Victorian missionary activity has been very badly tarnished. It is as if missionaries were seen as the sort of auxiliary
Yes. Yes.
auxiliaries to empire, suppressing people and
Yes.
confounding local culture and so on. And
Yes.
actually, that's a most unfair reading, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, on the one hand, one has to admit that sometimes, I'm thinking of Canada now, in the much maligned residential schools, some missionaries were far too dismissive of native cultures. So my view is that no culture under God is entirely worthless, and that in order, when native peoples adopted Christianity, many of them adapted it too. So there can be a bit of a negotiation there, and so some missionaries were too rigid. But I mean, first of all, as I suggested, the idea that missionaries were simply the lapdogs of empire is not true. Partly because colonial officials didn't want missionaries around, and missionaries weren't allowed to enter India by the East India Company until the 1830s for that reason. And then when they got there, I'm thinking now of New Zealand. Not only did Christian missionaries persuade Maori to stop cannibalism, when British settlers were stealing lands from Maori or pressing them on the ways, it was the Christian humanitarians who started lobbying London to stop it. So the idea that missionaries are simply extending colonial oppression is a long way from the truth, I think.
I want to turn actually now to the question of the Anglican Church itself. I mean, you've mentioned the fact that there are hundreds of millions of Africans, black Africans, who are now Christian. And there have been many ructions in the Anglican community over the past recent decades. And I wonder, do you find this upsetting, this disturbing? I mean, for instance, the question of the moment is this question of the blessing of same-sex unions. And this is causing distress amongst many Anglicans. How do you, as an Anglican priest, confront that? I mean, it seems from the outsider's point of view sometimes that, there have been compromises. How long can the compromises go on, I suppose, is the question. Some people seem to be on the brink of leaving the church over this particular thing.
Yeah. So, Robin, you put me on the spot, because this is an area I've tried not to get too involved in, because most of the rest of my colleagues are obsessed with it, and I wanted to think about other things. But since you ask, I mean, in terms of we have a political compromise within the Church of England itself, and it's not no one is entirely happy with it. So, right now we can bless gay marriages, but we can't actually marry gay people. Now, in principle, part of me think that may be the right place to be, insofar as I do think that in the history of the Christian view of marriage, it is marriage as the, particularly as the stable environment for the production and bringing up of children that makes marriage special. And although, yes, so in an ideal world, I would reserve marriage for couples who are in the business of having children. My problem is I'm married, I don't have kids. So practically speaking, it's too, and of course, gay people now can adopt and have kids. So you can't any longer, if you ever could, preserve the institution of marriage simply for couples who are in the business of procreation and bringing of kids. So we have an uneasy compromise here. I believe in compromises. It's messy. And we could stick together if enough of us could, if if gay people and those lobbying for gay people could live without the full works of marriage and have a blessing instead. But if they push it, then we will split apart, and that I think would be a tragedy, simply because that so much of the churches, whichever church we're talking about, so much of the church's time and attention and energy is being spent on this, whilst other things are happening around us we can't pay attention to. I just think it would be, can we not reach a place where we can agree to disagree, and because we agree to disagree about so many other things, be it abortion, be it war, be it whatever, we can't agree to disagree on this. So I'd be in favour of living with this compromise. However, moving out of the Church of England to the Anglican Communion, we know that there are great tensions between African Anglicans and Western Anglicans on this. If a compromise were possible, but maybe that trying to forge a compromise between very convinced liberal American Anglicans and very convinced conservative African Anglicans is just impossible. Well, then we have to suffer some kind of loosening of the bonds. Although it has to be acknowledged, the bonds between African churches are not that tight anyway. So we may just have to loosen them further.
When you finally, you as a convinced Anglican, when you look at the church as a national church, to what extent do you think it is right that the church accepts that part of its role as the national church is to adapt to the national culture, rather than the other way round, as it were, where the church stands against trends in modern culture and says, no, this we stand against? Is the fact of the establishment of the church, does that make witness perhaps more difficult?
Just to put my cards on the table, Rob and I support establishment as we now have it. Does establishment present the temptation to blow with the zeitgeist, to accommodate oneself to wider culture, just to keep wider culture on board? Yes, it does. But then I would say we need to discern the spirits. Sometimes wider culture gets it right. The Spirit of God is out there too. So just because something is fashionable doesn't make it wrong. But no, we can't just follow what's fashionable because we're scared of being unfashionable. And I think the Archbishop of Canterbury has said this, has he not? If, as some have threatened, Parliament were to try and force gay-sex marriage on the Church, I think Archbishop Justin has said, well, then we would disestablish. I think that's right. So the answer is yes and no to your question. Yes, it presents a temptation. No, it's a temptation to which we should not succumb. Sometimes we should yield to culture because culture's got it right, and sometimes we shouldn't. And if that means disestablishment, then so be it.
Finally, and I do mean finally this time, I always think that the Christian faith, that if you're Christian and sincere in your faith, you can't be a pessimist. You cannot despair. Are you an optimist? Looking now, as a Christian, having lived a life during which Christianity has really lost its place for many people as central to their lives and in national life, how do you view the future? Are you optimistic?
I'm hopeful. Optimism is a bit too strong for a Scotsman. I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful, partly because the church in this country has been in a bad place before. The 18th century church was pretty moribund. and 18th century society ignored it a lot. So it's not the first time. And secondly, again, I guess I think people outside of the church, a lot of them are puzzled rather than hostile, and a lot of them nevertheless intuit things the church stands for, and so that, you know, on occasions they will turn up. I mean, the funeral of Her late Majesty, as will the coronation of King Charles III, will be significantly religious, and people will turn up. Of course, they'll turn up for all sorts of reasons, but I think the rituals communicate and they inspire. So I'm not despairing.
But we need a new Charles Wesley.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do.
Nigel Biggar, thank you.
You're welcome, Robin. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.